Music, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first office hours of 2021. Happy New Year, and I want to welcome our special guests of the new year. So John, Scott, and Larry are going to be joining us to talk about systemic change and why it is so difficult. But I want to thank you guys for joining us today. I think if we're going to be talking about the complex problems, then we need the big brains, and the big brains are definitely here. So I appreciate you joining us here today. So as we get started, just to kind of lay the groundwork for our conversation today, what we're going to talk about is systemic change, big change, changes that are extraordinarily difficult, whether it's societal, whether it's organizational, where people are feeling overwhelmed by the problem and having difficulty solving the problem. So when we face that, and I'll pose this as an initial question to our group here, where do you start when you have an overwhelming problem that needs to be solved? Anybody want to kick us off today?
Yeah. Who are the big brains again? We'll jump in. One of the things that I learned when I started studying systems and complexity was what are the best questions to ask when you're confronted with a problem? And one of the questions you should not ask immediately is, what am I supposed to do? One of the questions you might ask would be, what kind of problem is this? And if I can answer that question, what kind of system approach or what kind of methodology would be the best fit for it? This is a kind of framework question. And so it's really taking a step back from what you see and then trying to understand a little more about the current reality of what's going on. And so that's not exactly a diagnosis, but it's more like a situation awareness. Well, what's really happening here? What am I confronted with? And how should I start thinking about it? And there's a lot of ways to answer that, but let me stop and give you the alternative as well, because I remember I was with Russ Akoff, and someone said, where do you start? And he said, start where you are right now. Just where are you right this minute? That's a good place. You can still ask these other questions, but it begins with really your position in the current reality.
So is it important if you understand where you are that you know where you're going, or is it enough to know that you just need to change and that any change is an incremental improvement and the solution will be emergent?
I can't be the only one answering this, but my friend John Fielder, who was a professor of applied ethics, used to say, if you don't know where you're going, it does not matter what route you take. So it becomes very important to have a sense of what you would like to see that's actually different. If you don't like where you are, you have to have a big change. What is it that you do want? And who's the you that wants it? Particularly if it's a large community of people, stakeholders, etc. So again, it's sort of understanding the reality. What do we have and what do we want? Who's the we? What's the best way to appreciate all of this? Frame it. Is there a framework that goes with it? And then how do you figure out what kind of approach to follow to, alter the situation to something that's improved or on its way to be improved, something like that.
Okay.
A lesson learned on this from our friendly Dr. P there is that reference scenario. If you don't have an understanding or agreement on where you are, very difficult to move a group, small or large, much less an organization, forward. Why change? Why move? You got to know where you are and have some understanding articulated. So, Johnny, I defer to you on this. You're the one who gently infused that into me, or other days maybe beat it into me, but it's had an impact.
Well, I think that first of all, it's all to do with the mindset, right? With the world. How do you look at your organization? If you're looking at it as a social system, then you do things very differently than the way that you do it when you look at it like basically a machine that you have created to serve the purposes of basically shareholders and so forth. Now, the important thing is this, that today you have to have an appreciation for basically knowing that there are new and very complex class of problems that formulating those problems becomes more important than applying the kind of solutions that you know today. Larry was saying that they're sometimes called wicked problems. Acuff used to call them mess. Sutherland calls them ill-structured problems. They are the kind of problems that their formulation and solution is not amenable to the things that you have learned in the classical management education. And that's why, for instance, everybody pretty much who are in this field agree that the most important thing and the starting point is the formulation of the problem. And now with everybody becoming familiar with the framework which was developed by Dave Snowden, especially, in which, are you dealing with a simple, with complicated, complex, or a chaotic situation? Because then that defines what kind of a response you require to develop. So,
all right. So if I can stop you there, so it sounds like if we have a problem, first thing we need to do is we need to recognize it's a problem. And then based on what we've talked about in previous shows, we have to basically think about the Snowden or other frameworks to understand the problem and the environment that we're in that we need to solve, which I would strongly recommend. Go back and you can find at learningcommunities.com previous shows where we discuss some of these problem-solving frameworks. But it sounds like there's another recognition that our problem is part of a greater system. And I think one of the challenges that we have as leaders is that we're not trained to think systemically. Matter of fact, our entire education system is all about kind of this reductiveness where we're focused on breaking up the problem in a little part, optimize, solve your little part, and then kind of move from there. Where the system may not be the actual way we're thinking about this. So given that you guys teach systems thinking to a lot of people at Jefferson, how do we start changing the mindset to become more of a systems thinker? So where do you start, Larry John? How do you help somebody as they're starting to think about the problem to understand what it means to think about it as a system problem?
Right. So, John and I were working on a project for a few years in which a company asked the same question. They said, we do not in our organization adequately think in systems. How do we learn to do that? And so we really immersed ourselves in what might be called the teaching and learning of systems thinking. And that's not the same as systems approaches and particular system methodology. This is actually the construct of thinking in systems. And I remember reading a paper by Barry Richmond, who had been teaching systems thinking through the lens of system dynamics. I think he was at Brown at the time for 10 years. He wrote a paper saying, as I reflect on my 10 years of teaching systems thinking to MBA students, I have concluded hardly anybody learned anything. And They certainly didn't, when they left the class, do anything about what they supposedly learned, but I'm even questioning whether they learned it, which was a real epiphany for me. It was really a question of how do you learn how to think? How do you learn how to think? And not only think, but think in a particular way. And you said this when you started, Joe, almost everything that we've done over the years in our culture has taught us not to think in systems. And so the question is what are the processes that would convert one to learn in systems? And so there's a series of those that have been generated. There's not exactly a rich literature, but there's a collection of people who are then communicating and forming a little group trying to figure out how to answer this question. And it sort of begins with the following basic idea. How do you learn anything? Well, you learn everything by show and tell, which means you have to do it, and then you have to be able to communicate it in some kind of language. So there is a language assistance. What are the words that you use? How do you say these things? What are the ideas that have to be communicated verbally? What are the rules of a system? How do they work? What informs something else? All of that, sort of the description of the processes and activities, is a communication process. The doing is more profound. Okay, how do you practice these kinds of things? Are there examples of games you can play? Cases that can be solved, things that you can do in your work life where someone is mentoring you and says, now tell me what you see, and how is that working? That's the beginning of these processes, and it does not occur in a 15-week semester.
Yeah. So let's start with that, because in our pre-call, when we were starting to talk about this, you guys used an example to me, which was illustrative of a car. And you gave, there's two car examples you talked about. So John, do you want to share with us the car example?
Yep. Look, if you are going to teach, systems thinking, okay, you have to start with asking some, giving students some challenges where you find out what kind of method of inquiry they're applying to that challenge. Now, Akoff used to say that, for instance, do you know why the Brits drive on the wrong side of the road? I give you from now until the doomsday, use your, analytical thinking and tell me why. And obviously nobody could say why, because the explanation for that would come from the containing system. Namely, you have to look at Britain, UK itself, and go back to, historically see how that was involved. So method of inquiry is very important. Now, what we are taught today is the traditional approach is to teach us to use analysis. And analysis, we know at the most, is going to give us the knowledge of how something is working. So if I want to know, if you give me a car, for instance, and you want to know how that car works, the only way that I can explain it to you is through analysis, But if you ask me, what is the function of the car and so forth, I'm not able to do that through analysis. I have to do it through, another different way of thinking, which is synthetic. And that's where I say that the property, car is a system. And the property of that system is transportation, right? And if you look at something as a system, you have to know that the systemic property emerges out of the interaction of the parts. Right? All the parts, they have to interact in order to make car to take you from A to B. And the example, again, Akoff used to give was to illustrate that, how many different models of car exist today in the United States. So students would say that like 275 or whatever. And then he would say that if we, analyze each one of those 275 car models to find out which component is the best, like which model has the best engine, which one has the best transmission, and so forth. And then let's say that we decide that Rolls-Royce has the best engine. So we bring the Rolls-Royce engine. Then Mercedes has the best transmission. We bring the Mercedes transmission, and so forth. Now, he would challenge you in thought process to put these together, and then he would ask, do you honestly have a car? If you have the Rolls-Royce engine, you have Mercedes transmission, and so forth. Obviously, you don't, because the parts do not fit together and do not hit it. Therefore, you lose the systemic property, which is the transportation. So when you're teaching, in my humble opinion, is to start with saying that, what is your method, of inquiry?
Yeah. By the way, you said there was also another way to think about the car, because if I optimize the engine and I give it more horsepower and more torque, that isn't always the best from a system standpoint. Because it was you, Larry, who said if you took the engine out of the car and just put it on the ground, it doesn't go anywhere.
Exactly.
So you pull a piece of the system out and throw it out there and then assume that it's going to be better, because it only functions within the context of the system and it doesn't function outside of the system.
Yeah, this idea of optimizing the parts, making the best parts you can, whether those parts are departments in an organization or whether they're components of a project that you're working on, optimizing the parts in a system does not optimize the whole system. In fact, it can have an opposite effect. It can decrease or cause other things to fall apart. John used to have a car when he was living in the UK, and a friend told him, oh, you should get a bigger engine. So I got a bigger engine, and then he says, well, the wheels don't work. So now you need all new wheels. He says, when you put the wheels on, well, then the back end is too light. He's got to put on a different back end. He says, yeah, but now the seats don't work,
The braking system.
Braking didn't work.
You have to have a different braking system and so forth. And that was the first time that I appreciated what it means, by having something, as a system. And by the way, one of our mutual friends who's a great systems thinker, he always gives the example from the biological system. He says that, look at us, look at our hand. Our hand can help us to write, it can help us to, grab things, move things, and so forth. Now let's imagine that we detach the hand from our body and put it on the table. Now you tell me, what does this hand, or what can this hand do?
Yep.
Nothing.
So let me start with simple before we get back to the wicked problems, because I know you have some interesting ones to talk about. But let's say that I work as a simple accounts payable person in an organization, and I'm just optimizing payments to vendors. But I want to make a change. But obviously, that's part of a greater system for the organization. And so the point is, if I'm in my little department and I can't control all of these other pieces of the system, and I can't necessarily understand what either some of the other implications might be. So, for example, I just say, arbitrarily, I'm going to stop paying people in 30 days. I'm going to pay people in 90 days. So that makes my numbers look better. But obviously, it could have cataclysmic consequences for the organization, because small vendors could go bankrupt. People decide that they don't want to work with you because you got a bad reputation, yada yada yada. But how do I, as an individual leader in that small cog in the big wheel, think about the things systemically? Scott, right. You work at a big organization. Do you have any thoughts about that? Scott, you're on mute. Sorry.
No, thanks for that, Joe. We have the chorus of dogs in the background this morning. Sorry.
Okay.
Thanks for lobbing that one to me. So, it goes back to a shared understanding. What's the environment that we're in? Do we understand what we're trying to achieve together? If we are not achieving it, why not? So back to your accounts payable person. What will happen if we make this adjustment? An appreciation for the interrelatedness, the interactions necessary for things to happen. So if I change that function or some process, what does it do to Larry in finance? Or what does it do to John in distribution? What does it do to the strategy people? Has it altered the relationship with the customer or the student or the patient, the member, the buyer, whatever? So asking, back to both John and Larry highlighted this, asking thoughtful questions that enable members to develop an understanding and, equally important, an appreciation of what's going on together. What does that interaction of the parts create? What's the yield? What are we doing together that we couldn't have done on our own? So that hand that John cut off and put on the table can't do anything unless it's connected to the arm and the body. But when it is connected, it can do a lot of things. When that accounts payable person is connected into an accounting function within a finance operation that interacts with human resources, supply chain, logistics, the other parts, we can do things. Little changes have great impacts, the whole butterfly effect thing. But one question before I yield I want to address is when you said, you asked the question, how do you learn this?
Yeah.
My experience with John and Larry is that you learn this by talking through it. So what else can we apply this to? We had a great conversation with colleagues of yours from Duke and CVS Aetna, and we asked the question, why did CVS and Aetna wake up one day and think that they needed to be together? What would they do differently together that they couldn't do on their own? Well, all of a sudden they were a health and well-being company together, where on their own they were an insurance organization, noble, important, or a local convenience and drugstore that distributed pharmaceuticals. But together they could do things differently. So applying that is something, Larry, John, I appreciate the two of you spend a great deal of time ensuring that students can do. Okay, help me understand how it goes here. What other industries does this impact?
Yeah, this talking through is important, guys. There's actually a theory called verbal protocol analysis, in which you examine the talking through of this kind of story that Joe that suggested. Well, what would happen? Who do you report to? Where does your report go? And then who gets it? And what's done with it? And then where does it go after that? You begin to track the contribution that an individual makes to the whole organization of which that person's a part. If they don't do anything of any contribution, then they're sort of like, the appendix. Nobody knows why it's there. But if it is important, then there's a role to be played. And this protocol analysis is one way of doing it. You can also model this. If it's the kind of problem that's pretty well structured and definable with clear boundaries, you can create a diagram of where the document goes and who it influences and how that moves around. Again, if you see the whole, either in terms of your understanding by verbal or because there's a diagram, you begin to think of a system as something that's alive and in motion.
But what's interesting is, and I'll use another metaphor. So recently there was a company called Haven that just announced they're going bankrupt. So 2 years ago, to great fanfare, I think it's called Haven, basically in the healthcare system, we'll come back to that when you guys talk about your Trilemma research. But in the healthcare system, you had basically Warren Buffett, Jamie Dimon, and Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, and JP Morgan Chase come together to say, we're going to solve the systemic healthcare problem in the United States, and we're going to transform healthcare. And 2 years later, they packed up shop and said, we failed. And if you read in the Wall Street Journal, like one of the rationales for the failure is that self-interest got in the way. And what I mean by that is that they all came up with ideas, but like Amazon did it their own way, JP Morgan did it their own way, and Berkshire Hathaway did it their own way. Even though they were together, they had the same idea, but they didn't really implement it consistently across the companies. They all did their own thing. So doesn't that pose a problem when we get into this kind of system thinking world that like incentives and biases and self-interest kind of get in the way?
Sure does. John told me a story one time about a workshop that he was conducting with 3 or 4 other people. And it was all supposed to be a coordinated workshop in which they were teaching this kind of topic. And each person did it his own way. And it ended up the same kind of confusion. Without a doubt. So obviously there was no shared understanding at the beginning.
But just one quick thing, Joe. You said that was it accounts payable?
Accounts payable, yeah, just paying the bills.
Okay, now that's a good one, because you could right away show that if you don't have a good accounts receivable as well, you're not going to have any money to pay anybody else.
That's
right?
all. Yeah.
So in systems, approach, there is a rule, and they say that it's a horizontal coordination, which they say that you have the right to change and do whatever you want to do in your own function, in your own department, as long as it does not impact somebody else. If it does, then you got to bring them into your, planning session and so forth. So it's important.
Yeah. Which is difficult to remember in large organizations with multiple moving parts, even with individuals who have the best of intentions and collegial relations.
Yes. And again, back to different incentives for what they're trying to get improvement upon. What's interesting is that, just as a quick aside, while I was actually driving over New Year's, I was listening to Hamilton, the biography of Alexander Hamilton on Audible, and I got to the part where they were talking about the U.S. Constitution and creating it back in the 1780s and early 1790s, and the whole point was, all the states in the Articles of Confederation basically had their own incentives, and they were very selfish, and they didn't really want to help the other states. And in order for the delegates to come up with a new contract, essentially the new constitution, they all had to kind of go meet in secret and not tell the rest of the states what was going on, so that they could actually come up with something that was better for everybody, that they could then sell back to them as why it was better. In a way, is there a lesson learned here to what we have to do for organizational change when we kind of face these wicked problems as an organization?
Can I just say quickly, your example, of Amazon and the other. Yeah. Remember, in systems thinking is transdisciplinary, right? The teams that you form, they can't be, multifunctional or whatever. They are transdisciplinary teams, meaning that when you bring people together, you have to strip them from their affiliations. They're there to focus on something which transcends the 3 organizations. And that is, I think Larry and Scott agree with me that it's the role of a good facilitation. And I honestly believe that, for instance, Akoff was incredible in doing this kind of work. To make them to think about something which is, transcends each one, organization. Otherwise, it goes back to what Larry was saying, that they try to, optimize their own, interest at their, and sub-optimizing the whole.
Right. So, Joe, you're asked about individual purposeful behavior. The perspective that the individual has a powerful self-interest, which can at times supersede the larger picture of what the organization might need. And that is a variable within systems thinking, which is important and cannot be ignored. And the realization, however, of how you fit in the system must also be learned. One of the arguments about self-interest is that it's a moral perspective. Should you have a self-interest? At what level do you decide that it's better to help others? At what level do you decide the whole is greater than the individual parts? These are considered in democratic cultures to be higher order values. It's not just what I want, it's what would be good for all of us. And I'm willing to compromise at some level if it's important for others to be effective and successful as well. It's part of the culture in which we believe it's important to support as well. Children are highly self-interested, and adults are supposed to be, more rational and supportive emotionally as well about the needs of these things.
So why then? Why don't we move to the topic of the trilemma? I know you guys are working on a paper where you're talking about society's trilemma, and I think this is a good way to introduce that conversation. So do you want to kind of share a little bit about what you're talking about with the trilemma?
John?
You want okay, I start. Okay, so we've been thinking that how do you classify what is happening right now? How do you explain it? And you're familiar with dilemma, which is basically it's two things that are wrong, and you don't know how to manage the two. Now, trilemma is when you have three things that none of them, by themselves, they offer a suitable solution to the challenges that you have. So from our perspective, when we were looking at what's happening today, we said that it's a trilemma because you've got three things that are interacting with one another. You've got health system, you've got the socio-political system, and you've got economic. And then we said that, look, if you try to maximize the performance of the, say health, which was, for instance, go through this complete lockdown, which a lot of countries, they have tried. Look what's going to happen to the other two. You have, like pretty much your economy goes, down the tubes, and, you're going to have all kinds of unrest and so forth. So when we looked at it, we said that, if we take a systems, put a systems, thinking lens, here you got three systems, that are interacting, and they are creating a higher level system, which we were calling it, super complexity. Super complex. The characteristic, the property is super complexity. And super complexity, we said that, if you're not careful, the weight from this super complexity is going to destroy every other system. Now, what do you do?
Right. So let me just say another word about this. The idea is that we live in systems all the time. We've always had a healthcare system, and it's not been functioning in ways that many people have been happy. We've always had a financial system, and there's always been strains up and down. At some points it's good, but there are still issues with it about global economics and how to manage it. And we've always had social political systems that include not only how we get along together, but rights of individuals and issues of distribution of wealth and of power. All of these things always exist. But over the last year, these things have really come together. And they've been interacting in ways that we didn't want them to interact. And with the polarization of thinking, partly due to the socio-political effects, the way that we're now trying to understand and address is creating not just complexity, but chaos. Every day, something new. The whole world in which we're living in the U.S. and globally is just becoming more and more unpredictable and unhappy, and we witness it every day. And if we look for a root cause, we're not going to find it. If we try to blame a single person, it's inadequate. If we try to address only one part, just like the automobile problem, it's not going to be effective and it will decrease the efficiency of something else. And so the argument always has been, at least in the last 30 years, that the only way to think about and address this kind of distinctive, horrible issue is by taking a system view. And so if we don't look at this as a system problem, particularly a systemics problem, then we'll never maneuver our way through this mess. That's the issue that we're trying to get to at this particular time. And labeling it gives it more meaning, we think. And because there are implications of that label. What does it mean if we call it that? What can we expect to happen if we call it that? What does super, do in other related domains, other metaphors? Then what happens? That's all part of thinking in systems.
So as you define this as a wicked problem,
super wicked
problem. What I see is, and maybe I want to make sure I'm not thinking about it in the old wrong way, but I look at it as almost like a triangle and trade-offs between the three. The metaphor that jumps to my mind is the old project management triangle. You got three things, you pick two.
Iron tree.
You got to pick two, and someone's going to have to compromise. Is the same true of your trilemma, or by thinking about it in a systems way, could it be solved differently?
Well, in a perfect world, if you could redesign some of the components and structures and contextual issues in ways that could improve the whole of the three, then you'd have a better way of addressing this than picking one or two. It's really, at least in my mind, a design issue. You can't redesign all the systems, but you can use design thinking to discover approaches that would be effective for all of the different parts.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it's a method of inquiry and then the method of intervention.
Go ahead, Scott.
Larry, this also amplifies the importance of your introduction of the verbal protocol analysis. Not only by naming do you begin to make these discussions more accessible, but by then working through. So, what are the strengths and deficiencies of a healthcare system that we have? Do we understand it? Do we interact with it? What are the financial and economic challenges and opportunities? What are the socio-political challenges and opportunities? By working through it and finding that understanding, or at least attempting to find an understanding, describing it together, is an essential part of this. Because back to Joe's point of incentives, healthcare incentives are not necessarily associated or aligned with financial and economic incentives, nor are they always in line with socio-political incentives or structures. Multiple systems in conflict, it reminds me of, so how big do we need to draw the circle for the interaction of those parts that we're talking about? Or in this case, the interaction of very complex systems in and of themselves.
Right. Good question. And who makes these determinations? by what method does this all take place? I read this morning that I think it's a dollar store, which has hundreds of dollar stores across the country, has decided to pay every employee who gets a vaccine. So that's a direct financial incentive and perhaps a reward for operating in a positive healthcare environment.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think it brings up another issue, though, which is what is right? What is the right thing? Because when you're talking about these systems and you're talking about the wicked problem and the wicked solution, I might have a different view of what I think the right outcome is versus somebody else if I have a different set of values or goals associated with that, which seems to be one of the challenges we have today, which is, you said at the beginning, we all have to agree on what the problem is. Right now, we can't even agree on facts. So how can we agree on what the problem is? And then back to the solution, some people might want to, for whatever reason, think that the solution is one thing and the other people think the solution is the other thing. So we can't agree on what the solution is to create the right system for it. How do you address that? Is that just facilitation?
Right.
Joe, can I venture to say that?
Please.
To start with, you need to bring these different people together, and you got to have some kind of a catalytic process that is going to align, through that process, align the purposes, because that's another thing. In systems thinking, they say that your biggest challenge, because we look at social systems as the components as being purposeful. So one of the challenges that you have is the alignment of the purposes. And the alignment of the purposes is going to come through some kind of a catalytic process. And of course, we're back again to facilitation.
Yep.
Right.
So you can't have these, the biggest mistake that is being made is this, that bringing people together for a discussion session is not going to give you an answer to your problem, to your challenge. You got to get them involved. You got to put them into the design mode. Because when you put people into the design mode, they're going to reveal. Again, Yakov used to say that if you do that, you're going to see that people will reveal what's in their head.
All right, so I want to be practical. I'm a leader. Is my responsibility goes beyond, I'm a convener, so I get the diversity opinion in the room. I also, what else do I do? Besides the diversity, what else do I need to do?
Right, but again, it has to do with the kinds of questions you ask and the methodology you're applying. So supposing you were saying, what would it look like if it was ideal? What's your version of this situation where the problem does not exist? All right. Okay. What do you want? What would it look like? What are the characteristics? What are the properties of a situation or a company or an outcome or a social activity where you don't have a problem? What does it look like for you? What's your version of this? And as you, right? And so now it's a value proposition for each person. It should have this. I would want it if it had that. My value tells me this is what it should look like. That's an approach to trying to discern what are the common elements that everybody does want.
All right, so I'm a convener. I work through an idealized design process.
Or some version of that. Part of it is just going towards trying to figure out what is it that you would want if you could have whatever you wanted.
All right. And then I answer the Drucker question.
You have to put that up.
Actually, the one quote of him that is, something that everybody likes and they repeat is this: the righter you do the wrong thing, the wronger you become. Right?
That's the Akoff question.
Yeah.
No, that's the one that people love that quote.
So you like this one: the righter we do the wrong thing, the wronger we become.
Yes, yes, and we have we have so many examples, because when you're dealing with, say, problems or challenges, that they are not amenable to the traditional ways of problem solving. Like, for instance, you apply continuous improvement. Camry was a good example, right? There was a design problem, but they kept on improving everything, and it got even worse.
Yeah.
So this is where you say that, hey, wait a minute. This approach is not the wrong approach to the situation that we are in. Therefore, let's engage in redesign of the product, or redesign of the system.
Yeah.
And one other thing, Joe, I think is very important to mention is this: that because you started by saying that why is it that it's so difficult to change, systems. First of all, we have so many examples of companies that they have existed for hundreds of years, and they have in the process they have changed, and they have transformed themselves into new things. DuPont is one of them. DuPont started as what? As a what was it? Black powder, manufacturing company. The good one is Nokia, right? A pulp company. Then the most important thing is this: that from what I have seen and read, that all the successful transformation and change of systems has happened when the approach was multi-dimensional. So, for instance, they looked at that and understood what is the depth of that change. Okay. Then, what is the pervasiveness of change? And then the degree of complexity existing in the company, and approaching it, systemically.
Yeah. So I know, Scott, you also were suggesting, you got an article and a case study about Volkswagen, where they were trying to become, or is it Volkswagen or Ford, which was going from a car company to a mobility company.
Yeah, I love this example, and the reason. So, put the politics and getting people aligned on pause for a moment, but then ask the question, are we as an organization, as large and successful and complex over a duration of time as Volkswagen, are we doing the right thing? What are they right now? They are an automotive company who has been successful in optimizing automobiles in a current state. They've got a portfolio of automobiles from Volkswagen through Porsche. These are fine automobiles, and these are brilliant people doing it, hardworking individuals doing it with great success for shareholders. But the question becomes, why do we continue to optimize manufacturing an automobile when really what we might become is a mobility company? Back to John's point earlier, we want to get somebody from here to there, from A to B. Well, that's about mobility. That's not necessarily about the automobile. That's large systemic change. That's the kind of thinking, back to multiple comments, of mindset that needs to take place. If you continue to optimize the automobile, right now we're making automobiles larger, but we have fewer people in them. We're making them faster, but many of our roadways are even more congested than ever before. So what are we solving for? Volkswagen, in the article that I'm referring to, and we'll make it available after the session, is a mobility company. It's an organization that gets people from A to B. That's transformational thinking, I would argue. It's not just evolutionary thinking, it's transformational thinking. It's bold, it's courageous, it's risky. it's very risky because it will eventually change the order of things.
But there are two aspects, though, to this. One is you ask yourself, it's time for me to change, and I'm going to change to what, right?
Yes.
But then is how am I going to change in order to achieve that vision that, we are all so excited about it.
Yep.
Now, there are a lot of examples. Federal Express, they're the people who were successful in changing their, mission and their raison d'etre and so forth. Now, in the case of, Volkswagen, have they implemented that vision?
Well, there's a lesson to be learned.
That's their intent.
There's a lesson we learned, I think, related to this, to what Elon Musk is doing at Tesla, which is he's all about sustainable transportation. So when they're building electric cars, you can't just build an electric car if you don't have the battery and the battery charging ecosystem around you that supports the electric cars. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Tesla doesn't just focus on cars. It's focused on power generation. It's focused on batteries. It's focusing on charging stations because you need that ecosystem in order for your electric car to work. And to some degree, why are they the most valuable company in the world right now relative to the automobile industry? Look at General Motors, look at Volkswagen. GM is just building an electric car. They're not building an ecosystem because they aren't thinking about the problem systemically. And so to some degree, it kind of goes back to that mobility. Like if I'm not thinking about it in the larger context, I'm not going to be as successful as the company that actually thinks about it and understands the ecosystem that actually has to be created.
Agreed.
So what's the argument? The argument is that these individual companies, leaving Tesla aside, may be more concerned with self-serving behavior rather than looking at the whole system and saying, whatever I'm creating, however I'm going to be doing it, how will it impact the whole of which I am a part? And if you don't take that additional step, if you don't look at the whole, transportation system as a system, then you end up having a problem. You may sort of optimize yourself out of existence, or you may do this in the short term, but not the long run. You may co-produce effects that you don't want to occur later down that you didn't see because you didn't look at the feedback loops. You didn't sort of scope it all out. And you probably, due to federal trade regulations, didn't bring all the manufacturers together and have a chat about what is it that we are doing and why are we doing it this way and how do we help each other, because that's against the law. Well, why is that the case? Well, that's because, policies are written in the containing system not to help the individual parts, but to, protect them against unfair practices. So obviously you can't, it's a whole complex problem. And that's part of the trilemma as well.
Yeah.
Is each of these individual systems is sometimes at odds with the other system, and yet they interact all the time. And now they're interacting and producing a super problem, and we're all the victims of that.
Yeah. And by the way, the reason I think I got confused with the Ford example with Scott is I know that Ford, in a way, is doing some of this because they're convening in Detroit, Michigan, basically a space where they're inviting the entire automobile industry to come to them to rethink mobility for going forward.
See, that's
we can't do it. We need you to come in, partners, competitors, to help us rethink this together. And that's really, kind of forward thinking if you're going to kind of lead a change.
Yeah.
John has a story about how Ford brought together some of the leading systems thinkers in the world years before the financial collapse.
And they trained 2,000 people.
Exactly right. I mean, it was led by, and they've written documents on this, and they were the one of the very few automotive companies that didn't fail when everyone else was, because they. That's right, because they had rethought themselves earlier on. So it's not a surprise that they would be convening a meeting such as this now. It's just a follow-up of how they had been thinking before.
Yeah.
By the way, Acuff example of doing, wrong thing right was always a car. You can read it in all his writings. He always used to say that, car is the worst product ever created.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And I still also like the Drucker quote as well, because I think it's important to ask, are we doing just things to make them better, or are we doing the right thing? Because, back to Acuff's comment, if we're doing the right thing and we make mistakes, then that's actually learning. Whereas if we're doing the wrong thing and we make mistakes, and then we just try and keep improving on that, we get rewarded for doing the wrong thing right, then it's the wrong reward incentive system. We're not learning. We're actually just getting worse.
Yeah.
But I think this has been a useful conversation to kind of lay the groundwork. I know we're getting to the very end of our time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if we had to summarize, where do we start when we have to start dealing with these kind of super wicked problems? It sounds like you guys gave a couple of very important recommendations. Number one, it sounds like we have to start with defining the problem and agreeing that there is a problem and what exactly it is. Secondly, we have to come up with some idealized design solution to understand where we're going. Third, we need to be a convener as a leader to get the people involved that are going to be stakeholders throughout our system to do it, but to give them, and this is to me the most insightful part of the conversation we had today. Maybe it's obvious to everyone else, but it's not just about diversity. I don't just bring in a diverse group. I have to separate them from their function and say that this diverse group, separate from their function, is creating a team to go solve the problem.
Yep.
And that seems like an overlooked step that a lot of companies don't do when they try and come up with these solutions.
They always have multifunctional teams.
Absolutely. But they represent their function. And
exactly. And try to maximize the benefit to their own function.
Exactly. And that's where the self-interest is getting out of the way, because we're not looking for the overall purpose of the system. But it does sound like that in that process, we need a convener. We need a facilitator to drive this.
And especially somebody who understands systems thinking, because your first step is to get the people to look at their own organization as a system and telling them, what does that mean? What changes? Right, folks, or wrong? Because it seems like I'm getting wronger every minute.
Yeah, that's okay.
And you're learning from it.
Yes. Well, this is great. We got a nice comment. Thank you from our audience from GS Campbell, who I assume must know one of you guys being a former student. But other than that, I want to thank everybody for their time today. And hopefully we can continue this conversation at a later date. And I'm looking very much forward to hearing about the Trilemma research article when it comes out, because I think we do need those solutions. So thanks everybody for your time today. And if you want to get in touch with anybody that was on this call or find out more information about what we've been talking about, please check us out at learningcommunities.com. Looking forward to seeing everybody in a future office hours. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.